You're listening to an Energized Exchange, a podcast series brought to you by Holland & Knight's Energy and Natural Resources team. This series will cover the latest developments and trends in energy, climate change, environment, and natural resources.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Holland & Knight's Energized Exchange. We're excited to be here today to discuss with you all the recent FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, their Transmission Planning Rule, Order 1920. My name is Elizabeth Noll. I am joined by my colleague, Nic Martell. I am a senior policy advisor here at Holland & Knight. In my practice area, I support clients that are seeking federal funding and financing for clean tech solutions. A big piece of this is in and around the electricity sector and transmission investments. Prior to joining Holland & Knight, I was at the Department of Energy and the Congressional and Intergovernmental Affairs Office. I was there during the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. And as we will discuss later, kind of saw how the administration was beginning to think about deployment in and investment in the electric grid, like the establishment of the Grid Deployment Office. So we'll touch on that later, but Nic, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. My name is Nic Martell. I'm an associate in the Nashville office for Holland & Knight. I am an energy associate, specifically in the energy regulatory space. Previously to joining Holland & Knight, I was at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission with the Office of General Counsel. So I got to see how the sausage was made there at FERC and got to learn from some really great folks there at the agency. So we will go ahead and kick this podcast off. So Elizabeth's going to help us set the stage here. Can you provide us with some context for this rule in the broader environment for electricity and how it kind of sets the stage for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nic. So, I think as most folks know, the last decade plus for electric utilities, we've seen, flat or declining load growth, but that is all changing on its head across the board. We're seeing load forecasts for electricity demand doubling and even tripling. For example, PJM's forecast as of this January was showing, an expected load growth of more than 3x. And some folks are even saying that that is going to be an underestimate for expected demand. So, why is this happening? There's a piece of this that is associated with the supply side. We've seen anticipated and announced retirements of, electricity generation, and that's been happening, fairly steadily in recent years. But then there's been this big shift on the demand side of the equation. Customers are really demanding more capacity for a number of end uses. Most notably, we're hearing about data centers that are increasing demand on the system, end use electrification, like electric vehicles. And then there's also been just huge investments in the manufacturing sector, largely driven by the recent, IIJA and IRA passage. The Clean Investment Monitor, for folks who are familiar with it, this is a joint effort by the Rhodium Group and MIT Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. They've been tracking the clean energy and clean tech investments. They have this comprehensive database that they're reporting, a $67 billion investment in manufacturing and deployment of clean energy, clean vehicles, building electrification, and the like. That $67 billion in the fourth quarter of last year represented like a 40% increase over the same period in 2022. So we're just seeing a ton of new demand coming on. And why does this matter for transmission? It's fairly simple. The ability for these manufacturing plants, these data centers to get the power will really determine where it gets built. So as states are contemplating or trying to attract new opportunities, they could really be at risk of missing out on, economic development opportunities if the grid can't keep up. So, the increased focus and increased discussion at the state, the federal, the local level around power is really an extension of, how is the transmission system going to help deliver that power to these facilities, to these new opportunities? So that's kind of the context that we're having this conversation in. But Nic, I'm going to turn it over to you. Can you give us, a little bit of history as to this order and kind of, what is FERC's role in the transmission space?
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth, for that helpful context. It's a really big deal out there. There's a lot of exciting stuff going on, and FERC plays a major role, not only in the regulation of transmission, but the planning and everything that goes into that. It is a complicated process, and these orders are here to help facilitate the planning and the procedure and everything that goes into making this as effective and efficient and transparent as possible. So FERC has issued a number of orders in the past that really created the foundation for this draft final rule that we see today. FERC had a number of previous orders, specifically orders number 888, 890, and 1000. In those orders, the Commission kind of incrementally started to develop these requirements and how we think about and govern regional transmission planning and the cost allocation process. Specifically, the order number 1000 set out a number of regional cost allocation principles, many of which still need to be followed today with the new order that we see, with things such as the costs that need to be allocated within the transmission planning region, and that it needs to be roughly commensurate with the estimated benefits provided. Additionally, anyone that does not receive benefits from a project cannot be allocated those costs involuntarily. And also, it was established that there is a cost-benefit threshold ratio. So the numbers were thought about, and basically the outer bounds of the cost-benefit threshold were established previously. But most importantly, the thing that they come back to over and over again in this process was an established way to carry this process out that is transparent and keeps all parties involved, because it is a huge grid and it is a huge project, and all parties need to be involved to understand the magnitude of being able to put a project like this together and have it done effectively and efficiently. So today, what we have is the order that came out with the Commission's May 13th special meeting, and that all began under Chairman Glick when the Commission originally considered these new rules. In July of 2021, there was an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. A year later, in April of 22, we saw the notice of proposed rulemaking that proposed the specific reforms that we got in the final rule just a couple weeks ago. And I just want to shout out FERC staff, because I think between the ANOPR and the NOPR, there was something like 30,000 pages of comments. This was a huge undertaking for staff, for them to gather all of these comments and respond to them and put everything together and give us this final rule that we see today. It was a huge undertaking, and it's a big step forward for the grid.
So Nic, you were probably there for some of that, but also have been pouring through the rule that we got last week. So tell us, in broad strokes, what's in the final rule?
Yeah, so there were two rules that actually came out. Obviously, the big one was the cost allocation transmission planning rule, more affectionately known as Order number 1920. But then there was also the siting backstop authority rule that came out, Order number 1977. So I'll go ahead and start with Order number 1920. This transmission planning and cost allocation rule tried and did achieve in establishing a more thoughtful transmission planning process. The order requires FERC-regulated transmission providers to develop long-term 20-year plans, which identify the long-term transmission needs while working with the relevant stakeholders and relevant state entities. The new rule tries to tackle the difficult task of linking costs with those ratepayers that benefit from a project. So I'll kind of describe the order in two buckets, the first being the transmission planning aspect, and then the second being the cost allocation. For the transmission planning, the order aims to make the transmission planning process more forward-looking. The FERC jurisdictional transmission provider specifically need to develop a long-term transmission plan that evaluates the transmission needs over this 20-year timeframe, and that will be reevaluated every 5 years. The plan has to look at different scenarios to account for the changing landscape and factoring in criteria set out by the Commission using the best available data, and take into account the risks associated with extreme weather and the effect that it has on the grid. I think something great that they did here was incorporating as part of the planning process, taking into account some of these new technologies like dynamic line ratings, the advanced power flow control devices, advanced conductors, and transmission switching, because these are important aspects to take into consideration with the rapid advancement of technology and the benefit they can provide to the grid as a whole, and in a cost-effective manner. And throughout the process of developing this plan, there were a lot of questions relating to what's the state role going to be in this whole transmission planning process. And first and foremost, there's an engagement period before any compliance filings are made to bring in these relevant state agencies into the process, which I think helps provide a forum for the cost allocation methodology and an opportunity for these relevant agencies to participate. It's important to note that these transmission providers are not necessarily required to adopt the results, but I think what it does is it provides a common ground, a common starting point for these negotiations to have all parties at the table. The order sets out an evaluation process, kind of laying out the specific criterias or benefits that need to be considered, leading to a result that tries to be as transparent as possible and not being unduly discriminatory, and provides an efficient mechanism for planning a long-term and cost-effective transmission plan. The next piece of this rule is the cost allocation piece, which basically requires the transmission providers to provide methods to allocate the costs of transmission facilities selected under the evaluation process that generally follow, the foundations that I described earlier that were put in place by Order Number 1000 with the regional cost allocation principles. It also provides an opportunity for states or interconnection customers to voluntarily fund all or a portion of the cost that might not be included because they might not have met the selection criteria in the evaluation process. So that's a long-winded summary of saying what's in the transmission cost allocation and planning order. And the other one that came out was the siting rule, or Order Number 1977, which adopts a backstop siting authority. This order implements a voluntary applicant code of conduct, needing additional record keeping and engagement kind of requirements between the applicant and affected landowners. It requires the applicant to show that it's made good faith efforts to engage with landowners and other stakeholders in the process, which is required under the IIJA. That siting order also requires developments to develop an environmental justice and public engagement plan, and requires an air quality and environmental report, tribal resources report, and an environmental justice report that'll be part of the NEPA review process. So if you want to read those orders themselves and really dig into some of the specifics contained in the rules, feel free to read them. I think between the two orders, you might be looking at about 2,000 pages. Or we have a good summary and analysis up on the HK website that we put together that might be a little bit more digestible.
Yeah, that's a great point, Nick. And we do have folks here at Holland and Knight that can help advise as you're trying to unpack these rules, because there's a lot in there. But these rules are final now. So I guess the question is, what comes next, right? Like, the final rule does not mean we're done. So what does this mean for RTOs, for utilities? What comes next?
So the next step is going to be compliance filings. The FERC has put out the rule, and now everyone needs to go back and put together these compliance filings. So the only thing that might put a stop in that process is at times there can be clarifications needed, especially with rules of this size. So there could be rehearing, as was in the Order 2023, the rehearing to create 2023A. Sometimes there's clarifications that are needed. So there might be a rehearing to clarify some issues in the orders themselves. But right now we are waiting on compliance filings. It is important to note that, there were some things in the NOPR that did not make it to the final rule, specifically with transmission incentives, the construction work in progress incentive, as well as the right of first refusal for incumbent transmission owners. So the commission might be taking up these issues in the near future. So keep an eye out for that. As kind of in conjunction with the compliance filings, the transmission providers will undergo that 6-month engagement period I kind of described earlier. So they'll be working with the states to get these compliance filings put together. And as for a time frame for these compliance filings, they have 12 months to submit the compliance for the interregional transmission coordination requirements and 10 months for all of the other requirements. So each transmission provider will be filing to basically show that they've adopted the pro forma language in the Order 1920. Also, just so people are aware, a year might sound like a long time, but these are major rules. There's a lot of stuff in there. So it could come up to, you'll see a year and people might ask for an extension at FERC, which is not uncommon. I know people will try their best. This is something that people have known is coming down. They're going to try to get these out within the year, but extensions do happen and they are granted at FERC. So we might see it pushed beyond a year. It's also important to note with the backstop siting authority that there could be significant litigation on that front. The last time this happened, it was struck down by the Fourth Circuit in 2009. So that's something to keep an eye out on as well. And with the backstop siting authority, it's important to note that even with the commission's support and this new rule, a project developer will not be able to condemn state-owned land currently because the commission lacks authority without Congress amending the current rules to the FPA to provide specifically for an eminent domain authority over state-owned lands. So, there's a lot of things to work out. There's a lot of stakeholders involved. There's going to be a lot of coordination, but we'll see what comes out of these compliance filings in the next year. So with that, we've walked through it, but we've got to be honest about this. It's not just FERC that's acting on transmission. These rules were great and it was a great step, but you were at DOE. You could say a little bit about what DOE is doing in parallel to help work with it and advance this build out of transmission.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Nick. There's been a lot of activity over the last few years, and more specifically, even just the last few months from the Department of Energy and from the Biden administration on transmission. Clearly, this is a priority and it recognizes the need. And this is happening both from a perspective of, how do we squeeze out as much as we can from the existing system in the near term, while we also try to facilitate and advance and accelerate the long distance and the broader transmission capacity to keep up with growing demand. And just to double click on what you said, Nick, on this order that FERC just issued, is now requiring folks to take a look at things like dynamic line rating and advanced reconductoring and those technologies. That's exactly what we need to be doing to squeeze as much as we can out of the existing system. There are quite a bit of incentives for folks that are looking to make those investments. Grid Deployment Office, which was established, on the heels of IIJA at DOE, they have $10.5 billion for investments in grid resilience and innovation. They call it their GRIP program. And in round one, we saw, the selections were made last year. Round two of those funding opportunities just recently closed. And there was a significant emphasis on, technologies like advanced reconductoring, dynamic line rating. So it's really exciting to see that. And I'm hopeful that we see, more investments in that area in round two. So we're really upgrading the system with these new technologies. DOE issued what they call their liftoff reports on innovative grid deployment and have highlighted a lot of these technologies that could be easily deployed and deployed cost effectively in a lot of areas. And then on the transmission side, the Grid Deployment Office, again, has been very busy. They got new authority and new funding opportunities for what they call the Transmission Facilitation Program. This was also in IIJA. This is basically like a revolving fund where the federal government is an anchor customer. This is basically going to ensure that there is going to be offtake. So you don't have to worry about the pesky problem of if we build it, will they come? But the federal government is going to step up to be that anchor tenant for transmission lines that are going to be built. And then as the federal government steps away and offtake is sold, then that money is then freed up for future projects. So We've seen 3 projects selected. We've seen the Department of Energy issue a second round for this program. And I know this is a really big priority for folks over at the Department of Energy. And then just in the last, few weeks, the flurry of actions by DOE building on, in conjunction with the Order 1977 on kind of the backstop authority and the transmission siting, DOE issued its first 10, I'm going to say this, the long name of the National Interest Electric Transmission Corridors, or the NITC designations. These are designations of areas where there lacks adequate transmission. So DOE has now designated these corridors. In the Inflation Reduction Act, they got $2 billion for direct loans to transmission lines that are going to be built in these corridors that have been designated. This is the Transmission Facility Financing Program, or the TFF. So that was recently announced. We'll see finalization of the NITC corridors, the NITC designations in coming months. And then that financing will help to make those and further those investments. And then finally, we saw DOE announce the Coordinated Interagency Transmission Authorization and Permits Program. DOE loves its long titles, but that's the CITAP, which is really meant to help expedite the permitting process. It designates the Department of Energy as the lead agency for coordination of federal environmental reviews for qualifying electric transmission facilities. I think, you see the administration both through financing, through grants, through loans, and through, trying to expedite through their existing authorities, how can we make it as easy as possible to really make these investments in the transmission system and the grid, which is just really incredible to see. It's been a lot of hard work and effort. Another shout out to all the folks over at DOE that have been working on these programs, because it really seeing them come to fruition in a really positive way.
That's great. Really, really good to hear that there is such good support and the ability to have these grants and all this money being put forward to help push this agenda forward, because that's really important. But this is just within the administration and FERC's existing authority. Is that enough? What's next? What else do we need?
Well, I think as well as I do, Nick, we could do a whole second podcast just talking about what else is needed. I mean, obviously, and you said it, within the transmission siting rule, there's still a need for congressional action there, clarifying authorities there. So I think, really the short answer is no, this is not enough. We do need congressional action to really deliver at the scale, at the level that we need to fully build out the electric grid. My personal opinion is I think it was a missed opportunity not to get the transmission investment tax credit as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. We've seen a lot of interest from, Senator Manchin and others on the broader permitting reform, trying to get that, advanced through other proposals that have been floating around. Holland and Knight has definitely been engaged in this space on behalf of clients. And I think we will continue to do so both from the legislative perspective in our public policy and regulatory group, but also, we have many clients that we're working with on the transaction side to help get these deals done, to really help advance, be it in the negotiations of loans or in grants, but also, just in the transaction of getting these deals executed. So there's so much more work to do, so much more work to be done. And you can be sure that, the team here at Holland and Knight is paying attention to this. If you have questions, if you are interested in exploring opportunities, please don't hesitate to reach out to the team. Nick and myself were supported by many others that are really engaging in this space across the board, and really excited to see where we can continue to advance the conversation. But with that, I just thank you, Nick, for hopping on this podcast and helping to unpack this really important rule. And thanks to all of our clients and others that are listening to this podcast in our Energized Exchange. And I look for more on the Holland and Knight podcast series on more opportunities to come.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks, Elizabeth. Happy to join and looking forward to working with everyone on these important transmission initiatives.
Thank you for listening to an Energized Exchange, a podcast series brought to you by Holland and Knight. For more information on our energy and natural resources team, please visit hklaw.com/ENR.